Number 1, the Library of Alexandria. Around 283 BCE, Ptolemy I Soter founded what would become the ancient world's most ambitious intellectual project. His stated mission was to collect the books of all the peoples of the world. That single directive turned a coastal Egyptian city into the undisputed center of human knowledge for roughly 3 centuries. How large was the collection? That depends on who you ask. Ancient sources claim anywhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls. The range is enormous, and the reason is technical. Ancient counting methods did not distinguish between a single scroll, a complete work, and a multi-volume set. A single play by Euripides counted as one work, but it might occupy 1 scroll or 3. Multiply that ambiguity across tens of thousands of titles, and you get a variance that historians still argue about today. What we do know is that the library was organized. A scholar named Callimachus created the Pinakes, which functioned as the world's first library catalog system. Think of it as an ancient metadata index. The catalog alone spanned 120 scrolls. That means it took 120 scrolls just to describe what was on the shelves. The acquisition strategy was ruthless. Every ship entering Alexandria's harbor had its books confiscated. Scribes copied the texts. The originals went to the library. The ship's owner received the copies. This was, in effect, a knowledge tax. The library was not a standalone building. It was part of the Mausion, a complex that included botanical gardens, an astronomical observatory, a communal dining hall, and dissection rooms. In modern terms, this was a full research university. Scholars lived there, ate there, and conducted experiments there. And what experiments? Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, proving Earth revolved around the sun. He did this roughly 1800 years before Copernicus. His work was housed in this library, and it was lost. Heron of Alexandria built a functioning steam engine prototype called the Or Eolipoli and designed programmable automata. These were blueprints for machines the Industrial Revolution would not reinvent for 1700 years. Herophilus conducted the first systematic human dissections and mapped the nervous system. Those anatomical records disappeared for over a millennium. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference to within roughly 2% accuracy and produced a world map that included markings for unknown territories to the south and west. The library also served as a site of enormous religious production. The Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced here. Alongside mainstream scripture, the library housed Gnostic Gospels and alternative Christian origin texts. It held the works of Berossus of Babylon and Manetho of Egypt, both of whom claimed that human civilization vastly predated the biblical chronology. That claim alone made the library dangerous to later authorities. So how did it end? The honest answer is that it probably did not end all at once. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar's fire at the dock spread to the Bruchaion quarter and likely destroyed a warehouse of scrolls, though probably not the main library. In 270 CE, Emperor Aurelian's forces damaged the Bruchaion district during civil war. In 391 CE, Bishop Theophilus ordered the demolition of the Serapeum, the daughter library, as a pagan stronghold. In 642 CE, General Amr ibn al-As reportedly destroyed what remained during the Arab conquest, though many modern historians consider this account apocryphal. 3 theories compete. The mainstream view holds that the library died by 1,000 cuts. Centuries of declining funding, civil wars, and religious conflict gradually emptied the collection long before any single dramatic fire. The archaeological historical position argues that the Serapeum destruction in 391 was the true killing blow, a deliberate act of Christian iconoclasm targeting pagan intellectual infrastructure. The fringe speculative theory proposes that the core collection was never destroyed at all, but smuggled out. Proponents point to the buried scrolls at Herculaneum in Italy, which provide the only physical clue of what Alexandrian papyri actually looked like. Today, most of the original library site lies beneath the Mediterranean Sea. Seismic subsidence over the centuries has swallowed the land. The knowledge is literally underwater. But if Alexandria is the most famous lost library, it is far from the only one. And in some cases, the motives for destruction were far more deliberate. Number 2, the Library of Carthage. In 146 BCE, Rome did not merely defeat Carthage. It attempted to erase it from the record of civilization. The library was housed in the Temple of Eshmun on Birsa Hill, the Acropolis of Carthage in what is now modern-day Tunisia. The context was the Third Punic War. The Roman senator Cato the Elder had closed every speech in the Senate with the same phrase regardless of topic, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Rome obliged. The city burned for 17 days. Archaeological excavations at Bursa Hill reveal ash layers 1 to 2 meters thick in the area where the library quarter stood. That is not incidental fire damage. That is systematic incineration. Carthaginian intellectual achievement was formidable. Their agricultural science was so advanced that the Roman Senate specifically ordered a single text preserved, Mago's 28-volume treatise on viticulture and olive farming, and this was translated into Latin. It was the only work Rome deliberately saved from the entire library. Everything else was considered expendable or dangerous. The Periplus of Hanno recorded Carthaginian naval expeditions past the Strait of Gibraltar and down the West African coast, possibly as far as the Gulf of Guinea. Carthaginian shipyards produced the quinquereme, a modular warship so effective that Rome literally captured one and reverse-engineered it to build their own fleet. The Kothon, Carthage's circular military harbor, could dock 220 warships simultaneously. The library held its architectural plans. Trade was Carthage's real weapon. The library contained records of routes to the so-called Tin Islands, probably Britain, and Atlantic shipping lanes that Carthage had kept classified from Roman merchants for generations. These were commercial state secrets. The destruction had linguistic consequences that still resonate. Punic, a Phoenician dialect, was the language of Carthaginian literature. With the library gone, nearly all Punic writing was wiped out. Carthage became one of the most linguistically erased civilizations in history. The philosopher Hasdrubal, who became head of Plato's academy in Athens under the name Clitomachus, had written original works in Punic. They vanished with everything else. Rome distributed some surviving texts to Numidian kings as loyalty payments, scattering remnants across North Africa. Then it replaced the historical narrative entirely. The story of Carthage was overwritten by Virgil's Aeneid with the myth of Dido and Aeneas. Accounts of Melech's child sacrifice were amplified as atrocity propaganda. The library had held the primary sources that might have contextualized or contradicted these claims. Those sources were ash. Thousands of indigenous property records were also burned, directly enabling Roman colonial land redistribution. The mainstream theory holds that this was standard Roman military doctrine: total destruction of a rival power's cultural infrastructure to prevent resurgence. The historical archaeological position argues the destruction was primarily economic. Rome feared Carthaginian trade networks and commercial knowledge more than its military. The fringe theory pushes further. Some researchers point to similarities between Punic artifacts and certain Mesoamerican objects, suggesting Carthaginian navigators had reached the Americas. In this reading, Rome destroyed the navigational records to prevent anyone from following those routes. What is certain is this: without the library, the entire pre-Roman history of North Africa was written exclusively by Roman conquerors. That void persists today, and the pattern of targeted destruction was just getting started. 2 centuries later, an emperor tried to use a library to reverse the spread of Christianity. He failed, and the books paid the price. Number 3, the Library of Antioch. Around 221 BCE, Antiochus III founded a library at Antioch. Centuries later, Roman Emperor Julian expanded it dramatically during his brief reign from 361 to 363 CE. Julian is known to history as the Apostate. He was the last pagan Roman emperor, and he attempted to reverse Constantine's Christianization of the empire by restoring traditional Greco-Roman religion. Julian's major intellectual work, Against the Galileans, was a systematic critique of Christian theology. The Antioch Library was its primary repository. The rhetorician Libanius, one of the most celebrated speakers of late antiquity, served as the library's intellectual anchor. The collection included the Orphic hymns, rare Neoplatonist commentaries, and detailed ceremonial manuals for state pagan worship. Julian's personal diaries allegedly outlined a plan to rebuild the Third Temple in Jerusalem specifically to undermine Christian eschatological prophecy. Syrian astronomical observations housed there contradicted the geocentric model the Christian establishment was adopting. Then Julian died in battle in 363. His successor, Emperor Jovian, immediately reversed course and returned to Nicene Christianity. Jovian ordered the library burned. It was a public act. Scrolls were destroyed in the city square as an explicit warning to the educated pagan class, the so-called Hellenes. The loss was compounded by Antioch's unique position. Sitting at the crossroads of Persian, Greek, and Levantine intellectual traditions, the city was the gate to the east. Texts existed there in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. Works by Porphyry, whose writings attacked the historical accuracy of the Bible, were specifically targeted. The library also held Roman provincial tax records that Julian had used for administrative reform. Burning them disrupted governance as well as scholarship. What followed was the brain drain. Scholars fled eastward to Sassanid Persia, transferring Greek knowledge into the Persian intellectual world. Later, Christian chroniclers labeled the library a nest of sorcery to retroactively justify its destruction. The mainstream theory treats Jovian's act as standard religious consolidation, eliminating the intellectual infrastructure of a rival theological position. The historical archaeological view argues the destruction was politically motivated. Julian's reforms had threatened the newly empowered Christian clergy's economic and political position. The library was the evidence base for his alternative governance model. The fringe speculative theory suggests the Neoplatonist texts contained genuine psycho-spiritual techniques that the early church considered dangerously effective and needed suppressed, not because they were false, but because they worked. The modern site is buried under Antakya, Turkey, and remains largely unexcavated. The 2023 earthquake caused further damage to potential recovery areas. The scholars who fled Antioch carried fragments of Greek learning eastward, and the empire that received them, Sassanid Persia, had its own magnificent library, one that would face its own catastrophic end. Number 4, the Library of Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon was the capital of the Sassanid Empire, which endured from 224 to 651 CE. The city sat on the Tigris River, about 35 kilometers south of modern Baghdad. The library's most significant single work was the Quadé-Nameg, the Book of Kings, the definitive chronicle of Persian civilization. It held the most complete version of the Great Avesta, 21 volumes of Zoroastrian scripture covering law, medicine, cosmology, and ritual. Military engineering manuals documented the technical knowledge that had allowed Persia to hold off the Roman and Byzantine empires along the Euphrates frontier for roughly 400 years. In 637 CE, following the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, Arab forces under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas captured the city. The famous quote attributed to Caliph Umar is among the most cited in this history. If they contradict the Quran, they are heresy. If they agree, they are redundant. Destroy them. Modern scholars widely dispute the authenticity of this quote. Some trace it to 12th century fabrication. The reported method of destruction was simple. Tens of thousands of scrolls were thrown into the Tigris River. What went into that water was extraordinary. Detailed maps of Silk Road trade routes. Metallurgical secrets behind Persian steel, early prototypes of what would later be called Damascus steel. Records from the Academy of Gondishapur, which functioned as the world's first known teaching hospital, synthesizing Greek, Indian, and Persian medical traditions. The library uniquely blended Indian, Greek, and Persian thought in a kind of pre-modern intellectual globalism. Sophisticated astronomical tables called Zij were used for navigation and calendar calculation. The physical setting matched the grandeur. The library stood near the Tak Kasri, the largest single-span brick arch in the world, approximately 37 meters high and 26 meters wide. The destruction ended Middle Persian, known as Pahlavi, as a literary language. It severed modern Iran from its pre-Islamic written heritage. Hundreds of Persian epic poems survived only as fragmented oral traditions. A handful of scholars who had memorized portions of the Book of Kings made it possible for the poet Ferdowsi to compose the Shahnameh roughly 350 years later. That 50,000 couplet poem was reconstructed from living memory. The mainstream theory treats the destruction as collateral damage of military conquest, standard practice in 7th century warfare. The historical archaeological position argues the Umar quote is a later fabrication, and that the library's decline was gradual, tied to Ctesiphon's abandonment as the capital shifted to newly founded cities like Kufa and Basra. The fringe speculative theory proposes that Sassanid knowledge was not truly lost, but absorbed. The Abbasid translation movement in Baghdad 100 years later may have been a reconstruction of Ctesiphon's intellectual wealth. In this reading, the House of Wisdom was the library's reincarnation. Recovery is nearly impossible. The extreme humidity of the Tigris Basin destroys parchment. But the tradition of absorbing rather than losing knowledge would not last. The next library on this list was deliberately targeted for its ideas. Number 5, the Alamut Castle Library. High in the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, at roughly 2,100 meters elevation, sat a castle that was virtually impregnable, Alamut. In 1090 CE, Hassani Seba seized it through infiltration rather than siege. He was the old man of the mountain. His order, the Nizari Ismailis, would operate for 166 years as a state within a state, controlling a network of fortresses across Persia and Syria. The Western world remembers them as the assassins. But the castle's true weapon was its library. The collection's technical core included advanced alchemy, mathematics, and the science of letters, a system called Jafror that combined esoteric numerology with what we would now recognize as encryption. The doctrine of Tawil, esoteric interpretation, allowed the Nizari to operate outside mainstream Islamic jurisprudence by reinterpreting religious law symbolically rather than literally. Alamut had a functioning astronomical observatory that predated the famous Merigay Observatory. It tracked planetary movements and recorded data on what the texts called the outer spheres. The library held works by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest polymaths in Islamic history, who would later build the Merigay Observatory after Alamut's fall. The most provocative item may have been the records of assassination, a 160-year operational ledger documenting political killings and the strategic rationale behind each one. Psychological warfare manuals described indoctrination techniques for Fedayeen warriors and the strategic use of the so-called hashish myth as reputation management. The cataloging system was designed for rapid retrieval during siege conditions. This was a military-grade information management system. In 1256, Mongol commander Hulagu Khan besieged the castle. The assassins surrendered. The Mongols immediately targeted the library. The historian Atamalik Juvaini was permitted to select books on history and poetry worth saving. The rest was consigned to fire. The Qiyamah documents were among the losses. These recorded a radical period in 1164 when the assassin leadership had declared the resurrection and formally abolished Sharia law within their territory. Hulagu reportedly inspected the so-called heretical books personally before ordering the bonfire. The destruction ended the Nizari as a political military force and pushed the sect into centuries of underground existence. The mainstream theory holds that the Mongols destroyed the library as standard procedure. They eliminated centers of potential resistance. The historical archaeological view argues Hulagu specifically targeted the ideological text because the assassin model of decentralized ideology-driven resistance was the one thing the Mongol military machine could not conventionally defeat. The fringe speculative theory suggests the library contained genuine breakthroughs in what we would now call psychology and pharmacology. The mind control and paradise garden legends may have been distorted. Accounts of sophisticated psychoactive and behavioral conditioning techniques. Recent Iranian excavations have recovered charred clay tablets and storage jars from the site, but no intact manuscripts. 2 years after Alamut fell, Hulagu's army turned south toward Baghdad, and what they destroyed there would become the most mourned intellectual catastrophe in Islamic history. Number 6. The Imperial Library of Constantinople. Emperor Constantius II established the library around 337 CE with an explicit mandate: preserve Greek literature from the decay of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. At its peak, the library held over 120,000 codices. Not scrolls, codices. Constantinople pioneered the transition from scroll to codex, the format of the modern book. That transition was itself a revolution in information technology. The core collection contained the official corrected versions of Homer, Hesiod, and the Attic Dramatis. These were the authoritative texts of Greek civilization. The library employed copyists as a full-time professional class. This was the first institutionalized effort to combat parchment degradation through continuous reproduction. We have only 7 plays by Sophocles today. The library once held over 120. We have lost roughly 94% of his output. The Secret History by Procopius, detailing the scandals of Emperor Justinian, was hidden here for centuries. The library held the formula and manufacturing process for Greek fire, Byzantium's napalm-like incendiary weapon that burned on water. That recipe died with the empire. Original Greek New Testament manuscripts and early church texts that contradicted the Latin Vulgate translations used in Rome were stored here. Galen's complete medical works, many now lost entirely or surviving only in incomplete Arabic translations, were part of the collection. In 473, a fire destroyed the so-called Dragon Scroll, a 120-foot parchment containing the Iliad and Odyssey. It may have been the most physically impressive manuscript in history. The catastrophe of 1204 was perhaps the cruelest irony. The Fourth Crusade, a nominally Christian military expedition, sacked Constantinople. Western European knights used library scrolls to fuel campfires and for crossbow target practice. In 1453, the fall of Constantinople to Sultan Mehmed II brought the final blow. Ottoman soldiers reportedly used books as insulation or sold them in markets for pennies, but the destruction also seeded a rebirth. Refugee scholars who fled with whatever books they could carry in 1453 literally triggered the Italian Renaissance. Cardinal Bessarion alone brought hundreds of manuscripts to Venice, forming the core of the Bibliotheca Martiana. The mainstream theory holds that the library died gradually across 1,000 years of fires, sieges, and neglect. The historical archaeological position argues the Fourth Crusade of 1204 was the true extinction event. The fringe speculative theory proposes that the Byzantine elite anticipated the fall and systematically buried the most valuable manuscripts. The Theodosian walls, the Athos monasteries, and the Vatican archives may hold undiscovered Byzantine texts. The connection to the Basilica cistern suggests an underground network of sealed storage chambers that has never been fully explored. Number 7. The House of Wisdom. Founded in Baghdad under Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809, and expanded dramatically under al-Mamun, who reigned from 813 to 833, the House of Wisdom operated on a guiding principle. The ink of a scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr. Al-Khwarizmi worked here. His name gives us the word algorithm. His book Kitab al-Jabr gives us the word algebra. The Banu Musa brothers produced the Book of Ingenious Devices, describing over 100 mechanical devices, including automata, self-trimming lamps, and trick vessels. Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics established the scientific method of experimental verification and is considered foundational to modern physics. Al-Jahiz described environmental adaptation and animal competition centuries before Darwin, a kind of proto-evolutionary theory. The translation movement was one of history's most ambitious intellectual projects. Scholars systematically translated lost Greek works into Arabic, Ptolemy's Almagest, Euclid's Elements, Aristotle's complete corpus. The collection housed works in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Syriac, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, synthesized research conducted here into the canon of medicine, which remained the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. Islamic world maps produced at the House of Wisdom showed the Earth as a sphere and calculated its circumference with approximately 99% accuracy. In February of 1258, Hulagu Khan's Mongol army besieged and sacked Baghdad over roughly 40 days. The Tigris River, according to the famous account, ran black with dissolved ink for days. It was said a horseman could cross the river walking on piles of submerged books. Estimates of the civilian death toll range from 200,000 to over 1 million. The Mongols kept some astronomical tables for practical navigation, but destroyed the underlying observational research. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, the same polymath who had worked at Alamut, managed to evacuate approximately 400,000 manuscripts to Maragay before Baghdad fell. The historical archaeological view holds that the loss, while immense, was not total. The Maragay Observatory became a partial continuation of the House of Wisdom's mission. The mainstream theory treats the destruction as military strategic. The Mongols aimed to shatter the Abbasid Caliphate's symbolic authority. The fringe speculative theory points to Nestorian Christian advisors around Hulagu. His wife Dokuz Khatun was Christian. The sack may have specifically targeted Islamic scholarship while sparing Christian communities in Baghdad, suggesting a religious motive beneath the military one. Modern scholars estimate this event set Islamic scientific development back by centuries. The ink dissolved, the book sank, and 1,500 kilometers to the southeast, another great collection was already burning. Number 8, the Library of Nalanda. Nalanda. The name translates roughly to insatiable giver of knowledge. Located in modern Bihar, India, it was the world's first residential university. At its peak, approximately 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers lived and worked there. Scholars came from Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. 3 massive library buildings bore names that reflected the ambition: Ratnasagarha, meaning ocean of jewels, Ratnodadi, sea of jewels, and Ratnaranjaka, jewel adorned. Ratnodadi was a 9-story tower, the tallest library structure in the ancient world. The most sacred and advanced manuscripts were stored on the upper floors. The entire collection was called the Dharma Gunj, the Mountain of Truth. The university had been founded around the 5th century CE under the Gupta dynasty and operated for roughly 700 years. In 1193, Bakhtiar Khilji, a Turco-Afghan military commander, attacked. The motive, according to historical accounts, was bizarre and personal. Khilji had fallen ill. His own doctors could not heal him. A Nalanda scholar named Rahul Sribhadra succeeded where Khilji's physicians had failed. Khilji reportedly burned the library out of humiliation at the superiority of the scholar's knowledge. The fire lasted for months. Reports say the collection burned continuously for 3 to 6 months. Archaeological evidence supports the extreme intensity. Excavations reveal vitrified bricks. The fire reached sustained temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to turn clay into glass. The losses included advanced Ayurvedic medical treatises, Vajrayana Buddhist texts on meditation and consciousness practices, and metallurgical descriptions of so-called ever-burning lamps, sustained chemical light sources whose exact mechanism remains debated. The Hetavidya school of formal Buddhist logic, which had challenged revealed truth claims of monotheistic traditions, was centered here. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang had visited in the 7th century and transported 657 texts back to China on horseback. Those copies are the primary reason we know what Nalanda contained. Tibetan monks allegedly smuggled select tantric texts across the Himalayas before the fire. Some may survive in Tibetan monastery collections. The mainstream theory holds that Khilji's attack was a military raid for plunder. He mistook the university for a fortress due to its massive walls. The historical archaeological view places it within a broader pattern of targeting Buddhist institutional infrastructure across northern India. The fringe speculative theory argues Nalanda's upper floors contained genuine scientific breakthroughs, including a solar year calculation of 365.24 days and consciousness techniques producing measurable physiological effects. From South Asia, we cross the Atlantic. The next destruction was not ancient. It was recorded by the man who carried it out. Number 9. The Mayan Codices of Mani. The date was July 12, 1562. The place was the monastery of San Miguel de Mani in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The act was called an auto da fe, an act of faith. The man responsible was Bishop Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar whose stated mission was extirpating idolatry from the indigenous population. 27 major codices were burned. Approximately 5,000 carved religious objects were smashed. Hundreds of smaller genealogical records were destroyed in a single event. The physical format of Mayan books was distinctive. Made from a model of fig bark paper, they were accordion-folded and could extend several meters when unrolled. Landa forced the Mayan nobility to watch. Their word for books translated roughly as souls. This was a deliberate spiritual execution. The intellectual loss was staggering. The long count calendar system tracked cycles of time spanning millions of years. This concept of repeating cosmic cycles was a direct challenge to Christian linear time, the theological framework of creation leading to judgment. The Maya had independently developed the concept of zero and used a base 20 numeration system. Their astronomical calculations included the Venus cycle accurate to within 2 hours over 500 years, eclipse prediction tables, and tracking of the Pleiades. The codices contained divine kings' genealogies connecting living Maya rulers to their gods. This directly challenged the legitimacy of the Spanish crown. Medical records documented hundreds of medicinal plant cures from the Yucatan jungle. The Spanish suspected the codices also contained maps to Old Empire gold treasures. Thousands of land ownership maps were burned, directly facilitating Spanish colonial land seizures. A striking physical detail survives. Maya blue, an extraordinarily durable pigment made from indigo bonded to palygorskite clay, still appears vivid on charred fragments. The codices' physical materials were more enduring than the conquerors realized. The catastrophic irony is that Landa himself later wrote Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, which became the essential Rosetta Stone for deciphering the very script he had destroyed. The Maya script became effectively unreadable for 400 years. It was not substantially deciphered until the 1970s through the 1990s. 4 Mayan codices survive. The Dresden Codex contains astronomical tables. The Madrid Codex holds ritual almanacs. The Paris Codex records prophecies. The Grolier Codex tracks Venus tables. 4 books carrying the weight of an entire civilization. The mainstream theory treats Landa as a zealous but typical product of the Counter-Reformation. The historical archaeological view argues the burning strategically targeted the ruling class's legitimacy. By destroying genealogical and land records, the Spanish eliminated the legal and political infrastructure of Maya governance, not just their religion. The fringe speculative theory argues that the long count's precision implies observational traditions spanning thousands of years. The destroyed codices may have contained historical records extending into the pre-classic period before 250 CE. The event is still commemorated in the Yucatan as a day of mourning. Number 10. The Library of Ivan the Terrible. This is the only library on this list that may not have been destroyed. It may have been hidden. The Liberia, as it is called, is a ghost library allegedly sealed in the subterranean levels of the Moscow Kremlin. It has never been confirmed found. Its origin traces to Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Her marriage to Ivan III in 1472 brought the collection to Moscow as part of a political dowry. This creates a direct link to the Imperial Library of Constantinople. The rumored scale is 800 to 900 rare Greek and Latin codices. Many were reportedly gold-bound or written on rare vellum signifying imperial status. The prize text would be Livy's History of the Roman Empire, specifically the Lost Decades, books 11 through 20 and 46 through 142. These have never been found in any other collection. Potential lost works by Cicero and Virgil may also be included. Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, allegedly used the library's legal and political records to construct the theological justification for the Oprichnina, his 7-year reign of terror from 1565 to 1572. The collection was reportedly stored in a custom-built underground stone room designed by Italian architect Aristotele Fioravanti, who also built the Kremlin's Cathedral of the Assumption. The library vanished during the Time of Troubles, the chaotic interregnum between the Rurik and Romanov dynasties from 1598 to 1613. In the 19th century, archaeologist Ignacy Stilitsky spent his entire career mapping Kremlin tunnel systems specifically to find it. During the 1930s, Kremlin excavations turned up traces of 15th century Greek bindings, physical evidence that Byzantine manuscripts were once stored underground. But no books. Ivan reportedly blinded architects of his projects to prevent them from revealing locations. The library's position died with his inner circle. Subsequent czars may have deliberately sealed the vaults to bury Ivan's violent theological justifications. The Third Rome Doctrine held that Russia was the successor to Rome and Constantinople. The library was political legitimacy made physical. The mainstream theory holds that the library never existed as described. Any Byzantine texts that reached Moscow were likely dispersed or deteriorated. The historical archaeological position argues it existed but was smaller than legend suggests. The Kremlin's tunnels are real and partially explored. The 1930s binding fragments are genuine. The fringe speculative theory proposes the library contains dark Byzantine occult texts that Ivan used to cultivate his terrifying image. Local folklore claims it is cursed and will only be found when Russia faces its greatest hour of need. It remains the holy grail of Russian archaeology. 10 libraries, 3 continents, roughly 2,000 years. The pattern demands analysis. The pattern of destruction. The destroyers fall into categories: military conquerors, the Mongols at Baghdad and Alamut, Rome at Carthage; religious authorities, Jovian at Antioch, Theophilus at Alexandria, Landa at Mani; hybrid political religious actors, Khilji at Nalanda. A recurring argument appears across cultures to justify destruction: the claim that destroyed knowledge is unnecessary. Caliph Umar's alleged quote at Ctesiphon mirrors Bishop Theophilus's justification at the Serapeum almost word for word. If it contradicts our text, it is heresy. If it agrees, it is redundant. Libraries are most vulnerable during regime transitions, Jovian succeeding Julian; the Romanov succession bearing Ivan's library; the post-Gupta collapse exposing Nalanda; the economic motive gets less attention than it deserves; Carthage's trade records; Ctesiphon's Silk Road maps; Maya land records. Commercial knowledge was as threatening as theological dissent. The ink into the river motif appears independently at both Baghdad and Ctesiphon, and metaphorically at Nalanda, a cross-cultural image of dissolved knowledge. The timeline of destruction spans nearly 2,000 years from Carthage in 146 BCE to the auto-da-fe of Mani in 1562 CE. The impulse is not era-specific. A figure of total loss emerges. Conservatively, over 1 million individual texts across all 10 libraries. The librarian's choice recurs throughout: Giovanni at Alamut, the Numidian kings receiving Carthaginian texts, Xuanzang at Nalanda. Someone is always forced to select what fraction survives. Languages died alongside libraries: Punic at Carthage, Pahlavi at Ctesiphon. Maya script rendered unreadable for 400 years. In at least 7 of the 10 cases, the destroying party held a monotheistic or centralizing ideology. The destroyed collection represented pluralistic, syncretic, or heterodox knowledge. Hypatia at Alexandria remains the only named woman in this entire narrative. The destruction of libraries was overwhelmingly conducted by and between male power structures. The brain drain effect created refugee knowledge networks. Antioch's scholars fled to Persia, Constantinople's scholars fled to Italy, Nalanda's monks fled to Tibet. None of the 10 libraries were destroyed by accident. Even Caesar's fire at Alexandria, the most accidental, occurred during a deliberate military operation. What survived and how? Xuanzang physically carried 657 texts from Nalanda to China on horseback across the Himalayas and Central Asian deserts. A one-man rescue operation. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi evacuated approximately 400,000 manuscripts from Baghdad to Marageh before the Mongol siege, the largest known library rescue in pre-modern history. Tibetan monks carried Vajrayana texts across the Himalayas. Some survive in monastery collections in Lhasa and Ladakh, and have only recently been catalogued. Cardinal Bessarion donated approximately 750 manuscripts to Venice after fleeing Constantinople. The Magot exception proves a rule. Rome preserved Carthage's agricultural treatise because it was too economically valuable to destroy. Pragmatism overriding ideology. Ferdowsi composed the Shahnameh around 1000 CEE from oral traditions maintained by scholars who had memorized portions of the Qadai Namag. 50,000 couplets reconstructed from living memory. The Arabic translation bridge saved entire traditions. Greek texts destroyed in Alexandria and Constantinople survived because Arabic scholars in Baghdad had translated them centuries earlier. Ptolemy, Euclid, and Aristotle all reached Europe via Arabic. Procopius's Secret History survived in a single manuscript copy discovered in the Vatican Library in the 17th century, one copy away from total loss. The Herculaneum papyri, buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, are the closest physical analogy to what Alexandrian scrolls looked like. Modern AI and infrared imaging are now reading them. The Vesuvius Challenge, launched in 2023, offered prizes totaling over $1 million. In 2024, teams successfully read multiple passages for the first time using machine learning on X-ray CT scans. Each rescued text became canonized precisely because nothing else survived for comparison. We have built entire fields of study on fragments. The question is whether any more fragments might still be recoverable. Modern searches and recovery attempts. Modern Russian archaeologists continue to map Kremlin tunnel systems using ground-penetrating radar. The Library of Ivan the Terrible remains an active target. At Antakya, the modern Turkish city sits directly on top of the ancient Mao-Se-Ion complex. Systematic excavation has been complicated by urban development and the 2023 earthquake. Nalanda, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2016, has ongoing excavations revealing vitrified brick layers. But the humidity and soil conditions of Bihar make parchment survival extremely unlikely. French archaeologist Frank Gaudio's underwater expeditions since the 1990s have mapped Alexandria's submerged royal quarter, including the likely site of the Mauseon, using sonar and GPS-positioned diving. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1946 and 1956, prove that 2,000-year-old texts can survive in arid conditions. This raises hope for desert-adjacent libraries like Ctesiphon. Multispectral imaging has been used to reveal erased or overwritten texts on palimpsests. Archimedes' palimpsest, scraped and overwritten with prayers, was read in 2005 using this technique. The Ein Gedi scroll, a completely charred Hebrew parchment, was digitally unrolled in 2015 using micro-CT scanning, revealing the text of Leviticus. The Timbuktu rescue of 2012 through 2013 echoed ancient patterns. During the Malian Civil War, librarians smuggled approximately 350,000 manuscripts out of the city in trunks, rice sacks, and donkey carts. The Dunhuang manuscripts, sealed in a cave in western China around 1000 CE and rediscovered in 1900, contained Buddhist, Taoist, and Manichaean texts. Proof that sealed caches can preserve knowledge for millennia. AI-assisted decipherment models are being trained on the 4 surviving Maya codices to attempt reconstruction of Maya script vocabulary. The Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum may contain an entire Greek philosophical library. Over 1,800 scrolls have been recovered. Hundreds remain unread. The mainstream view holds that targeted searches in specific microenvironments, dry caves, sealed chambers, and volcanic deposits have the highest probability of success. The fringe speculative position maintains that multiple major text caches remain sealed and findable. The Theodosian walls, the Kremlin tunnels, unexcavated chambers beneath the Hagia Sophia, monastery archives on Mount Athos and in Tibet. The Vatican Library itself holds approximately 80,000 manuscripts, many uncatalogued. It may contain texts from Constantinople, Alexandria, and other destroyed collections that were acquired by the Church over centuries and never systematically inventoried. The race against time continues. Climate change, conflict, and urban development threaten archaeological sites. Antakya's earthquake damage, rising water tables in Iraq, construction in Cairo. The fundamental challenge is that we often do not know what we have lost, which means we do not know what to look for. Why it matters now. In 2023, an estimated 2.5 quintillion bytes of data were created daily. But digital storage is not permanent. Formats become obsolete. Servers fail. Companies delete archives. The concept of the digital dark age suggests future historians may know less about the early 21st century than we know about the ancient world. Our records are stored in formats that may become unreadable. The pattern of physical destruction continues. During the Bosnian War from 1992 to 1995, the National Library in Sarajevo was deliberately shelled. Approximately 2 million volumes were destroyed. In 2003, the Iraq National Library was burned during the U.S. invasion. Thousands of Ottoman-era manuscripts and Abbasid period documents were looted or destroyed. Baghdad suffering again, 745 years after the Mongols. Between 2014 and 2017, ISIS destroyed the Central Library of Mosul, approximately 8,000 rare manuscripts, Assyrian archaeological sites, and manuscripts across northern Iraq and Syria. The Internet Archive, sometimes called the Modern Library of Alexandria, faces copyright lawsuits that could limit its ability to preserve and provide access to digital knowledge. When platforms shut down, user-generated content disappears. Vine, Google+, and countless forums have been erased. China's Great Firewall represents the largest ongoing information restriction program in history, controlling access for over 1 billion people. A majority of the world's data is stored by a handful of companies: Amazon, Google, Microsoft. These are single points of failure with no historical precedent. The Long Now Foundation's Rosetta Project is attempting to create a physical archive of all human languages on nickel discs designed to last 10,000 years. The Internet Archive stores over 835 billion web pages. Project Gutenberg has digitized over 70,000 books. Google Books has scanned approximately 40 million titles. The mainstream view holds that digital preservation is improving. Multiple redundant copies and distributed storage make total knowledge loss increasingly unlikely. The historical archaeological position argues the threat has shifted from physical destruction to algorithmic curation. What people can find and access is controlled by search algorithms and corporate decisions, a form of soft censorship more subtle than book burning. The fringe speculative theory warns that the concentration of digital infrastructure creates a scenario where a single catastrophic event, a solar flare, a cyber attack, an electromagnetic pulse, could destroy more knowledge in hours than every library burning in history combined. We built the Svalbard Global Seed Vault to protect biological diversity. We have no equivalent for humanity's intellectual heritage. The unburnable idea. The inventory of confirmed losses is stark. At minimum, 10 major collections spanning 2,000 years, 3 continents, and dozens of languages. Conservatively, over 1 million scrolls, codices, tablets, and pages destroyed. Languages rendered extinct or unreadable: Punic, Middle Persian, Classical Maya script. The survival rate of ancient literature may be roughly 6%, if Sophocles is representative. Of his more than 120 plays, 7 survive. But knowledge persisted through human effort. Ferdowsi rewrote the Shahnameh from memory. Xuanzang carried texts on horseback. Bessarion shipped manuscripts by sea. The heliocentric model documented by Aristarchus. The steam engine prototyped by Heron. The concept of zero used by the Maya. The proto-evolutionary observations of Al-Jahiz. All were recorded in destroyed libraries. All had to be independently rediscovered centuries or millennia later. Every library on this list was built on the same premise: that observation, recording, and transmission of knowledge about the natural world is the highest human activity. Every destruction on this list was driven by the same recognition: that someone else's knowledge is more powerful than your own authority. What burned at Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, Ctesiphon, Alamut, Constantinople, Baghdad, Nalanda, Mani, and beneath the Kremlin was not paper or parchment, it was time. The accumulated observation time of thousands of scholars watching the sky, testing plants, measuring the earth, and writing down what they found. That time cannot be recovered, but the fundamental laws they were studying, gravity, optics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, remain unchanged and available. The libraries are gone, the laws of nature they documented are not,